Welcome to episode 21 of Decision Points. Beginning this week, for the next few weeks, we'll begin taking an almost chapter by chapter look at the book of Ecclesiastes. So go ahead and open your Bibles up to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And while you're doing that, here's today's trivia. What does the word Ecclesiastes mean? Stick around to the end of the podcast for the answer. And now, reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1, we'll be reading from the New King James Version today. It starts off by telling us who wrote the book, Solomon. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Now, we're going to go through the rest of this chapter, verse by verse, without reading it per se, but it starts off here with vanity, futility, pointlessness. Everything is pointless, futile, in vain. What a bleak way to look at life. Now, knowing this is Solomon who wrote this, we know, being one of the wealthiest men who ever lived, at the peak of the king at the peak of Israel's kingdom, with land and so on and so forth, and fortune, being the wisest man who ever lived, trying to think, well, what happened to this guy? According to most commentaries, they believe that Ecclesiastes was written towards the end of Solomon's life. And if you know about Solomon's life, you know, towards the end especially, he began to pull away from God because of the many wives he had. His wives had tempted him and pulled him away in their own worship from the worship of God. He began to have so many struggles. He allowed his wives to set up worship temples in high places for their own personal gods. So it kind of adds up to see what's happening in his life. Although we don't know everything going on, Solomon gives us a very detailed approach. He goes through a list. Starting in verse 5, we're going to kind of paraphrase through these verses. But starting in verse 5, the sun goes up and down, but it just starts over where it ended. The wind goes north to south, south to north, it whirls about, and it comes again, just in a full circuit. The rivers flow into the sea doesn't fill up. The rivers come back again. The cycle of water, it just continues to repeat itself. The ocean never gets full. Men labor in verse 8. We're not satisfied with what we have or see or what we hear. We just keep toiling over and over again. Verse 9 is that infamous verse. There's nothing new under the sun. Nothing ever new occurs. Everything that's done was done. Everything that has been is and will be. And then just all these things are just making Solomon believe and understand in his own mortal mind there's no point to life. And so, skipping down to verse 13, Solomon tells us that he set his heart to seek out and search by wisdom concerning everything that is done. The burdens of man, all these things that God has given man to do. I want to find out the reason behind it. What's the purpose of life? And he says, in 15, he says that what makes crooked cannot be made straight again. What's lacking cannot be numbered. He said, myself, in verse 16, I have attained greatness. I've gained more wisdom than any man before me. My heart understands wisdom and knowledge. And I'm setting my heart and wisdom to understand the madness and folly that is this world. But what he finds out in verse 17 is this is like grasping at the wind. Again, there's no point. And verse 18 finishes up chapter 1, and he says, for in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. It's kind of like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize, the less you know. As we look into the heavens and the stars and other galaxies and our own galaxy, let alone, The more astronomers and scientists dig into these things, including under the ocean, in the land, into DNA, we find out there's a lot more that we really didn't know than what we think we know. We learn new things constantly. But what this knowledge and wisdom hasn't done for our scientists is the same thing that it didn't do for Solomon. It didn't get them any closer to the point of life. Finding out how things operate and why things operate are wonderful. I think God blesses that as we learn about knowledge and understanding of the world that He created. But when there's not a purpose behind it, it's futile, it's vanity. There's no way that we can be happy in our endeavors. And Solomon learned this. I'm sure he spent a lot of money. Talks about going across the world and seeing things and learning things and people bringing things to him and things coming to him. But in all that, he who increases in knowledge increases sorrows because it doesn't fulfill a person. See, Solomon sought out all these answers from his own wisdom. God blessed him early in his reign as king of Israel by the decisions he made, how he put things together as he worshiped God and had a purpose to his life. But towards the end of his life, when he's struggling, when he's falling away from God, he's trying to find his own way. What he found out was, according to his own ways, there's no purpose to anything. And that's how we begin the study of Ecclesiastes. It starts off in a very sad state. As a matter of fact, the first few chapters detail all the attempts of man throughout all of history. And this actually leads to all the things in the future we'll do. It helps us understand that all these things that we do with our own wisdom, our own intelligence, when we try to make sense of the world by our own means, is pointless. Some of the greatest scientists and secular minds today say that the point of life is to just keep the species going, to keep human beings continuing on in a better state of comfort. Well, if that's the purpose, there's no purpose specifically for me. And I find that there's no contentment if I'm just trying to make it better for the next generations. And what I say in that, and I want to back up a little bit, I'm not saying that making things better for our children and grandchildren shouldn't be a goal of ours. But the world is not getting better. Our generations are getting worse. The things that are happening, the discord, the disunity, the hatred that grows between groups and of people, we're not advancing as a species by trying to attempt to make things more comfortable for a species in general. There has to be a purpose or a reason. And that's what Solomon got caught up with. He doesn't understand what the purpose is. It's all vain according to his own wisdom. But the good news is that as we come to the middle of the book and to the end, we do come to a happy conclusion. I'm not going to spoil that for you. To find out what that conclusion is that Solomon reaches, read the book of Ecclesiastes. And be sure and join me the next few weeks as we look over this book and what Solomon learns through his wisdom, but more importantly, about God. Now, the answer to today's trivia question, what does the word Ecclesiastes mean? Well, looking it up in multiple places, there's a lot of variations out there. The general consensus says Ecclesiastes means either a participant or a convener of an assembly. Someone who draws people together to speak at an assembly, or people who are there in the assembly to hear. Which makes sense because Ecclesiastes is a call out from the preacher, Solomon, for an assembly, us, the readers of the book, to hear. Well, I hope today and the next few weeks on our podcast will help you get a better understanding of Ecclesiastes and the purpose of life to which God has created. So again, I want to encourage you to read the book of Ecclesiastes ahead of time and join me next week for another Decision Point.
Thank you for listening today, and if you enjoyed what you heard, consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review. It will help us reach more people just like you who need to hear this message. Also remember that you can stay connected with us by downloading our mobile app. Just search for Second Avenue spelled out on the App Store or Google Play Store. Thank you again for listening, and God bless.